proceedings with a short talk, which is an adaptation of a theme I've been exploring for the last couple of years. I've been working on peace studies between religions. That's what my doctorate is in. How we can reconcile and make peace between the religions of the world. And I've lectured at the University of Oxford and London and for many years. It occurred to me about 4 or 5 years ago that the devil is a key player in interfaith peacemaking, because all the mainstream religions in their wars, particularly in the Middle East, accuse the other lot of fighting for the devil. And this then justifies their merciless slaughter, which we've seen in Iraq with the rise of ISIL. The ideology of ISIL is that the West, the Occident, that's us, are literally the devil's children. And therefore there's no human rights for us. Therefore you can do terrorism. This is the ideological justification for terrorism, right? And it's similar with the extreme Zionist movement in Israel. Their treatment of the Palestinians and the Arabs is that they are diabolic, actually, because they do terrorism. So therefore they have no human rights. So they can be put in prison and tortured and whatever. And as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, I've met Palestinians and Israelis, on both sides trying to mediate. And they all say, well, what can we do? They're the devil, right? So I thought it's time we pay attention to this question of the devil. And I proposed this notion, I call it comparative diabology, which is the scientific study of comparative views of the devil in all different world religions, and philosophies. And I've developed that. I gave some lectures at the University in Oxford and London a few years ago. Some people might have heard of them, or you can see them on YouTube. And now what I want to do in this talk here, and also down in Allée-les-Bains, is I'm going to apply comparative diabology to the study of Mary Magdalene. Because I'm also proposing that we need to focus on Mary Magdalene as a very interesting figure who might help redeem the religious wars that are going on in the Middle East. That's my hypothesis. And that her unique history might show some light on this question of the devil, and how we can bring the devil in from the cold, and these warring religions can make peace. So it's a very ambitious project, right? But I think it's a necessary one. Okay, so moving on, let me just kick into it and say that last year I presented 68 fields of scholarship that I think Mary Magdalene studies entails. Mary Magdalene studies involves. And there's a bibliography over there which I published for that. It lists all the 68 areas, and then I did a literature search of every single writer I could find, going right back to medieval times, that has written about that aspect. So there's all kinds of fields involved in Mary Magdalene studies. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to say in each of those categories how the devil fits in. Okay? So the first one, just generally speaking, Mary Magdalene in modern scholarship generally, there is some interest in Mary Magdalene. There have been some interesting books. Now we put out here on the shelf most of the collection of my institute on Mary Magdalene studies, and there's quite a lot of interesting scholarship going on. I mean, Bruce has written a biography of Mary Magdalene, which is up there, I'm looking forward to the second edition following this conference, which will have even more juicy detail. Because I want to know, he's started the ball rolling, but there's just many more questions to ask. One thing that obviously strikes one, and I don't think anyone has really studied it, is the question of this exorcising of the 7 devils. That's right in the tradition, it's in the Gospels. Mary Magdalene was possessed by 7 devils, and somehow Christ exorcised her. Some scholars therefore say that she then herself became an expert in how to become free of the devils that possessed her. Once you've been healed, you then want to share people's secret. I'm not sure if it was possibly Bruce makes that possible. You propose that as a hypothesis in your biography. It makes sense to me. So that the Christ ashram was going around Now we would probably say they were just doing advanced psychotherapy on people. They were reintegrating their personalities, etc., etc. You know, we might not want to talk about literal possession there, but some people would. And I know a psychiatrist at the Royal College of Psychiatry who's Scottish, who runs a psychiatric unit in a London hospital. He developed a spirituality working group at the Royal College of Psychiatry in London. And he discovered that if you hypnotherapeutize somebody who's got really serious schizophrenia and hearing voices and feels possessed, he's tried hypnotherapy on them. And he can talk to the individual voices that are inside them under trance. They tell their stories, why they're possessing this person, and he asks them very politely to leave under hypnosis. And he gets a 99% cure rate using hypnotherapy on schizophrenics, which all the drug treatments don't do. So he's using the model of, yes, there are actually spirits possessing this person, and he's getting cures. That's empirical medical work being done in Britain. So maybe we should come full circle, and maybe we should look at that as a model. In which case, maybe Mary Magdalene understood all that. Which would be good news for all the schizophrenics hearing voices, of which there are many millions around the planet. You know, if just a bit of gentle hypnotherapy can cure them, what are we waiting for? Let's bring that back. The second question is the whole Gnostic traditions of Mary Magdalene, including in her Gospel, which is a report of an ascent through different levels of consciousness. Most of you will have read this. C'est l'Évangile de Marie Magdalene. C'est une histoire d'une ascension spirituelle dans les niveaux de l'esprit. And she is able to navigate through the demonic realms with Christ's help. And it's a bit like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you know, how to escape the dark spirits and go on to the next level of light. So my speculation is that Jesus was an advanced practitioner of consciousness elevation. He was able to take this woman through these stages of what we call diabolic experience, and then to come out the other side. I mean, this, you know, in the 60s, people with R.D. Laing experimented with acid and LSD, and, you know, that replicates those kind of experiences. And if you do it wisely, you come out to the light the other side. That's a very swift method of doing it. But it's a very important bit of knowledge. And if it's true that Maria Magdalene was the repository of that knowledge, that working experience, then again, that's incredibly important for us to recapture that. Another question is whether Mary herself had her own initiatory lineage in addition to getting that knowledge from Jesus. Did she? Some people say she was a priestess in her own right, she'd had her own initiations. Well, where's the evidence? How do we know? You know, those are interesting questions. And then there's the third question, is the apocalyptic visions of Mary Magdalene among neo-Gnostic groups, mystical groups. There's lots of sort of shamanic churches of Mary Magdalene operating. And what do they make of the devil figure? I've not seen in any of their literature. We had a presentation last year by Susan Laybourne who talked about some of them with the channelings and things. I think they sort of gloss over the devil role because it's a bit embarrassing. Nobody with any common sense believes in the devil anymore. But there's a lot of diabolic activity in the world still. There's a lot of negativity, violence. And I don't know, it's just a question mark. And then we have, I think I shared this the other day, more extreme sort of groups like Scientology that have a ufology explanation for the devil, and they think the devil was a, you know, Darth Vader kind of figure back in cosmic history. And there's a whole movement among modern Gnostic groups, if that's the right word, to explain world history in terms of diabolic intervention from different interplanetary beings. I'm going to suspend judgment on that, and as to veracity or not, I can just report as a historian of ideas that's the meme that's out there. Its origin goes back at least as far as Zoroastrianism. And, we'll come back to that in a minute. The next question is just how Mary Magdalene is seen in the history of art. This is a topic that some people have done PhDs on. You get the image of the penitent Mary is often shown, or the old, the one in the cave with the long hair, the fasting, emaciated Mary. I've not seen many images in art of the exorcised Mary, or it's a question. And also the question is how the devil is portrayed in art. He's normally got horns, fiery body and a tail. But not necessarily. We went into the church at Greenwich yesterday, me and Bruce, and we saw there's a very old Romanesque fresco on the wall. The devil is presented as a snake with a female head, curled around the tree of life, tempting Adam and Eve. So the female snake.
I'd also point out that her breasts were larger than Eve's.
Right, yeah, I noticed.
It's quite an extraordinary
trope. She was quite sexualised.
She was, yeah.
Definitely worth going into Greenwich Church. Dans l'église de Greenwich, près d'ici, il y a un fresco de le diable. Mais elle est une femme et un serpent, les deux. So, what does that history of art tell us about the human imagination? That's very interesting. I mean, in the caves not far, in the south of France where we're going, there are sorcerers presented in animal form, with animal heads and things. Maybe the devil images like an old throwback to Paleolithic consciousness, the shame and the shapeshifter. The healer, paradoxically, because the wounded healer is the one that can heal, Okay, so how would the teachings of Mary Magdalene and the current Church of Mary Magdalene differ from conventional Christian theologies? Well, I'm arguing that it's more experiential, and if the devil stands for fractured consciousness, there's been a split in the cosmic body between the goodies and the baddies a very, very long time ago, but actually that's a splitting consciousness between the two factions of being, and therefore to heal that represents wholeness. And then in addition to that, there's the external problems we face as a planet, like poverty, unemployment, suicide, depression, despair, hopelessness. I mean, these are the real devils, if you want, that I would like to exercise now. Wasted lives and ignorance as a teacher. I mean, most of the world's problems, I think, are caused by ignorance. So would it be more sensible to say there's these internal and external devils, and to work to triumph over that as a collective work? This is what I call the Seoshantic work, which is the Zoroastrian term for the Messiah, which is the origin of the word Christ. It's a Zoroastrian concept. Ahura Mazda created the world good. Angra Mainyu tries to cause trouble, but therefore Ahura Mazda sends different prophets. Zoroaster was one, and then there's a whole line, and then the Seoshant is going to be the final redeemer or Messiah figure. Christians believe that was Christ, but Muslims believe it was Muhammad, and Baha'is believe it was Baha'u'llah. What I'm arguing is maybe it's all of them, and maybe this work should be a collective thing, and maybe each should say what their particular genius has been. And Mary Magdalene is part of that collective Seoshantic work, because as the consort discussed, question mark of Jesus, she was his absolute core backup. And that would be the church of the next millennium, is that collective work, that collective Seoshantic work, in which we're all involved. To me, that's more Thomas-like, because that was the church of Thomas as well. The Gnostic tradition of redemptive knowledge, rather than just faith in a kind of abstract sense. So anyway, okay, I want to talk about the other thing that's very interesting is Jewish understandings of Mary Magdalene. Some Jewish feminists have kind of reclaimed her as a sort of Lilith figure, because they like Lilith, who was the rejected first wife of Adam and caused trouble by then going off and having an affair with the devil, you see. So what does that tell us? It's very interesting. Psychoanalysts have looked at this, feminist scholars, and there is. I think Mary Magdalene can be a bridge between Jewish and Christian self-understanding and other faiths. And in the Tree of Life traditions of the Kabbalah, male and female are both needed. You can't progress up the Tree of Life, the Sephiroth, without drawing on that dyadic energy. And it's the same in tantric teachings. So if Jesus and Mary Magdalene were initiates of that, then obviously they were consciously working in that tradition, which is to redeem from the fall of Adam and Eve. So if you reformulate that whole story as a tantric stroke Kabbalistic narrative, which we each recapitulate during our lifetimes, that to me makes sense. Then the church's job is to tell people how to get whole and how to reach enlightenment, actually, which is another word for wholeness, true wholeness. And that, I think, is what Mary Magdalene and Jesus were actually trying to do. Then there's the question, where does sexuality fit into that? Well, sacred sexuality is a very important part of that. True love, true marriage is a sacrament, and that's something the church has always been strong on. And all religions say that, that's why there's always big celebrations and so on. But actually, what is it that's so sacred is the fusion of male-female in a common work, in a common ascension to enlightenment. So instead of seeing sex as something unpleasant, unclean, suppress it, or do it in secret in ways if you can't be found out, like paedophiles and stuff, that's totally perverse. Celebrate it in a sacred context and enjoy and let it become a thing of wisdom. Now, I'm sure that's what Jesus and Mary Magdalene saw it. And this is what I call a wisdom affair. So I've coined this phrase. Instead of a love affair, I'm saying people should have wisdom affairs. And there's one of my books over there on the theme. It's a slightly Socratic, tongue-in-cheek proposal. I'm not saying abolish the love affair, it's great, but transmute it into a wisdom affair. I think Jesus and Mary Magdalene were a wisdom affair. So what about other Gnostic texts like the Pistis Sophia? Do they mention Mary Magdalene? What do they say about the devil? This is a huge work that needs to be done in works like the Pistis Sophia, which has 5 hymns of the Odes of Solomon in it, which is this Gnostic Judeo-Christian kind of songbook that was used by the early church. So I think there's a lot of research to be done in that early Gnostic period. We've got Bruce, who's worked on some of the... You said you were doing... Have you looked at the Nag Hammadi scriptures, or just... Mm-hmm. Yeah. But none of them were in Aramaic, were they?
No, they're all in Coptic,
yeah,
except for a bit of Plato, which is in Greek.
Okay. So, the study of these early texts that are being found, I think is very exciting. I think more texts will be found in the next decades. I live in hope. And one of the reasons I want peace in the Middle East is then archaeologists can get back to work.
Yeah.
What really annoys me about war and that poor archaeologist who was killed by ISIS in the temple for refusing to divulge where the treasures were. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist. I still am an archaeologist in the love of re-excavating the wisdom of the ancients. But I'm a spiritual archaeologist now. So let's make peace. Let's get back to normal cultural, respect for each other, and then these mysteries will reappear. I believe. It's interesting that Nag Hammadi was found just after World War II ended. Most horrendous conflagration up to that point. If we can prevent World War III, then we can find even more treasures. I think it's interesting that the Mary Magdalene Gospel was found at Akhmim in Panopolis in Egypt, which is a very interesting town. It was sacred to Pan. And in my commentary on the New Testament, I've gone into this in some detail, because the place Jesus loved most and took his inner disciples to was Caesarea Philippi, or Banyas, or Panyas, which is up in the north of Israel. I've been there, and it's a cave which is sacred to the god Pan, where the Jordan rushes out of the mountain. And it's very interesting that the initiatory tradition, that Jesus was working with, found that a sacred site. Well, lo and behold, we have a city in Egypt dedicated to Pan, where there was an awful lot of Gnostic stuff going on, and it's where Zosimus, the founder of theoretical alchemy, lived. Zosimus, whose dream visions were written about by Carl Jung in his book on alchemy. Jung thought Zosimus was a genius, and Zosimus had studied the books of Enoch. He knew the esoteric Christian tradition, he knew the Zoroastrian tradition, he knew the Jewish tradition in detail, and he put them all together in a kind of matrix along with pagan Egyptian, and that was alchemy. And he wrote a book, or 26 volumes, one for each letter of the alphabet, and only one of those books has come down to us. I lament the loss of Zosimus's complete works, but I have written a book, The Kabbalah Runes, which is a chapter for each letter. And like me, Zosimus believed that each letter, sound, represents a different energy of the gods, which in ancient Egyptian is called the netters. Egyptian word for gods is netters. And the gods were thought of as like energies or elements. So we're made of different elements, we know that from chemistry. But what are we psychically made of? Well, we're made of netters in different combinations. Anyway, what's weird is that it was exactly there that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene turned up. So, okay, that's very exciting. Another field, by the way, I think of this as a mandala. I know it's presented in a grid in table form, but you've got to think of this as a really complicated, like a Jungian mandala. And the Mary Magdalene mandala would have all these squares and patterns and shapes in different colours and textures. So we're coming back down to the history of art one, and that's the role of the penitent Mary. So this is just a slightly naughty thought. I'm saying, what if Mary was herself a pagan initiatress? What if she had her own independent Canaanite, Syro-Phoenician, initiatory tradition, and she was actually trying to encourage Jesus to come off the Jews are more superior to everyone else and don't let the dogs have any of my crumbs attitude, which peeks through. Jesus was a bit like that, whereas she was much more, come on, get off that, because we're all sacred and everyone's a goddess worshipper secretly. So I can imagine those kind of conversations going on, right? So the penitent Mary is supposed to be repenting, blah, blah. Well, what about the penitent Jesus for unleashing hell on paganism? That's a very naughty thought, because the Christians, so-called Christians, who I think only got a part of the truth because they suppressed the Mary Magdalene side, they then went around suppressing paganism. And they closed the temples down all over Egypt. They shut down the pagan initiatory schools. And when I worked with Carol Parish about rebringing the ancient wisdom schools back, that's kind of what we're trying to do, which is why I was interested in the Druids. So I think a lot of that lost paganism, I think we should reinvent an art theme called the penitent Jesus that is apologising for this. Then there's the question of Mary Magdalene in literature and fiction, feminist fiction. Some great novels and reconstructions have been done. Does the male lover have to die? I mean, the story, the plot line is, thwarted love, great man, but he has to die, and then she resurrects him. And that is the ancient storyline. Yeah. And yes, they were probably consciously or semi-consciously, archetypes are involved. Mm-hmm. They probably didn't have the language to know, well, what is this we're doing here? Is it a mystery drama? There's evidence Christ was connected to a Dionysian mystery cult with the use of wine and bread. And wine was sacred to Dionysius. And that was the origin of theatre. Now, Moses Gaster's son did a whole thesis on the mystery drama underlying Middle Eastern religion, professor of religious studies at Columbia University, and he argued that all the ancient Middle Eastern religions are actually enactments of theatre. And this plot, the lovers, the man has to die and then is resurrected, is the basic storyline, as well as the combat of the gods for who gets the goddess. That's the other one. So what about joyism? Instead of this violence where the male lover dies, why don't we rewrite the script, is what I'm saying, about mutual surrender and mutual joy, which instead of terrorism, because the terrorists are reenacting the script, they have to die because they represent the devil, then our God will win. Right? It doesn't matter how many people we kill and bomb because they are the devil. Right? So this God versus devil script is in the unconscious from these Bronze Age mystery cults where the two gods battle for who gets the goddess. Well, why don't we think ahead, outwit this in our collective unconscious and say, let's have a new game where instead of blowing each other up, we revere and celebrate and agapize each other, and through mutual love we reach a state of joyism instead of terrorism. I'm coining a new word here, joyism. Okay? C'est un nouveau mot que j'ai créé, joyisme. C'est le contraire de terrorisme. Alors, c'est le moyen de l'amour par la violence. And so then peace becomes a state of ecstasy, which is each of us functioning in our full potential, you know, and being conscious of these plots that are always running. Right, so this is number 13. This is a challenge to Bruce and his colleagues back in the biblical scholarship world. I want a comprehensive edition of the Bible with all these lost Gnostic texts included in it as apocrypha or something. So things like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the books of Enoch. The book of Enoch is in the Ethiopian Bible, actually, in the Old Testament. I'd like all the pseudepigrapha to be in there. And like call it a scholar's Bible, I don't care what you call it, but it would be about 10 times the size of the current Bible. And until we do that, I think we're shortchanging people in congregations around the world. Every Christian, whatever that means, should know about the existence of this literature and be guided by their pastor or their, Bible study people to study and appreciate them, because Christian history is so much more interesting and rich than people realise. And we have to undo this fatal oversimplification that Constantine, for political reasons, brought in, which is, here's the package, minimalised down, this is what we all... It's a bit like Theresa May and Brexit. Can't agree on anything, so they make a really simple thing, this is what we're all going to agree on. And of course it doesn't satisfy anybody because it has no intellectual coherence. And that's the state of conventional Christianity. So I'm saying recontextualise it, bring back the complexity, and actually we'll get real Christianity in the Mary Magdalene Jesus tradition for the first time by having access to all these texts, like the Pistis Sophia, the books of Enoch, which I spent 2 years commenting on, these books of Enoch, and also it will bridge between Jewish and Christian and Islamic thought, because Islam is really like the Quran is the last apocalyptic writing in that genre. It's another prophet doing what Enoch did, seeing the heaven worlds and being taught by God through the angels. It comes in that long lineage of Enochian writings. And the New Testament only makes sense if you read the books of Enoch, because Enoch is a series of 3 books about initiatory journeys into the secrets of the afterlife, which coexist here with us here now. It's not like when we die, we can go there now through the initiatory journey, which is the old shamanic journey that the shamans have been doing and the druids since the beginning of time. And they were drumming around their fires in the caves at Lascaux. So I think we have the right to know this. I'm a great believer in that the greatest human right of all is the right to knowledge, and it's the basis and capstone of all of them. And every totalitarianism always starts by burning books and depriving people of knowledge, and shooting teachers and calling them heretics. So this is what I call a scholar's Bible. I'd also like the Zoroastrian texts in there because they're so formative on Christian, Islamic and Jewish apocalyptic theory. Zoroaster starts this whole ball rolling as well by talking to God and being given the blueprint on how we can save this planet. All these texts should be in there. And also some of the Hermetic traditions. The other thing is scholars should really work on where the Babylonian, Sumerian origin of many of the biblical stories comes from. and there were German scholars working on this in the last century, that I'd love to see a book of Genesis interpolated with the original source texts of the flood legend and the tree of life legend, and giving the Sumerian and Babylonian texts in parallel, so that we can actually see where this all came from. It all came from the collective unconscious, to use the Jungian term, and that's us. And so we need to reclaim that on behalf of us, and stop seeing it as, there is no them in this narrative, it's only us. The thing we have to outgrow is the us and them story. It's us and us, and we have to realise that, and that's our mutual empowerment. St. Augustine has a wonderful passage. I have a love-hate thing with St. Augustine. He was a great scholar, I love him, but he was limited, and I'm more a Pelagian, as probably you'll realise, because, those are technical differences. But there's one thing where Augustine comments on the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, done in Alexandria, and I love Augustine because he's in love with scholarship, right? And he says, the Septuagint's amazing. The people that translated it must have been guided by the Holy Spirit when they did that work, just as the original prophets were when they wrote it. And he says, yes, and the Holy Spirit can inspire translators now as we read these texts. And I like that, because that's a very generous view of the Holy Spirit's work, that we, say at a little conference like this, we can be guided, if Augustine's right. And I think in this one respect, I agree with him. The mind of discernment we bring to the pursuit of truth can be and has to be guided by the Holy Spirit. And what is the Holy Spirit? Well, it's our intention towards wholeness, which is, Spinoza said the greatest pleasure is the intellectual love of God. Well, that's what I'm talking about. It's that intellectual pursuit of wholeness is the intellectual love of God, because God is defined as the absolute wholeness of everything. So, of course, we all ought to be in love with that. Alors, en français, je parle d'Augustine. Il dit que les traditions pour les scolaires, on peut diriger par l'Esprit, le Saint-Esprit. Et je dis que c'est possible. Et c'est nécessaire, maintenant. Voilà. Okay, another thing that's interesting is... oh, by the way, Augustine knew nothing about the Kabbalah. He didn't understand that. He had huge shortfalls. But, that's a whole other talk. What's the status of Mary Magdalene in paganism? That's interesting. Among contemporary pagan scholars, again, they mostly see her as a pagan goddess initiatrix. And I think that's kind of what Susan Laybourne was saying last year. Well, where did her initiatory tradition comes from? I've mediated among pagan groups. I know quite a lot of Wiccans, obviously Druids and other pagans. And it's very interesting. The Wiccans particularly are always fighting over status of initiation. My lineage of witchcraft is more powerful, more ancient than yours, they say. Therefore, I should be the first on the committee, publishing whatever it is. And the battles, the ego battles that go on among Wiccans are just as bad as among Christians or among Jews or whatever. It's all human beings doing this stuff. And I personally, my intuition is that Mary Magdalene probably absorbed many, many traditions. Galilee was a much more sophisticated region in the world than people realise. There would have been people passing through from as far as Persia and India and Greece and Rome, and it was a cosmopolitan area, part of the Roman Empire, which was huge. But that she probably kept her own quiet space of spiritual faith in her own traditions, and I would say that she was practicing what we call proto-Kabbalah, which is universal. It's not pagan, it's not anything, it's just universal. Another thing I've been researching is the tradition of Mary Magdalene among French and European occult groups. There's a long tradition of esoteric Freemasonry in France. I've been looking at that. I'm a historian of